Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grants webinar. My name is Paula Hyman with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I'm going to be your technical support for today's webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions box, and our presenters will address your questions at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded. Providing that the recording is successful, a copy of that recording and a copy of the presentation will be sent to everyone at the conclusion of the webinar. I want to thank you in advance for your participation, and I'm going to pass things off to Preeti Chowdhury, Executive Director with DriveOhio.
Thank you, Paula, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to see so many folks on the webinar here expressing interest in this recently announced funding opportunity. So the main focus of today will be the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grants Program. I am also going to give an update on another federal opportunity, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that the state is administering, just as an FYI for everyone on the line. So we'll start with a discussion on that National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, affectionately known as the NEVI program. And to recap the purpose of that was set out to provide funding to all 50 states to deploy a national network of EV, specifically electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Namely, it was meant to enable long distance trips. So those electric vehicle charging stations were required to be placed along highways and U.S. and state routes. So pretty prescriptive kind of purpose and intent with that program. ODOT received the funds for that program, and we at DriveOhio are administering it and executing on actual deployment. So the NEVI funding made available $5 billion nationally. Again, all 50 states get a portion of that by formula, and the apportionment for Ohio was about $140 million over 5 years. So each year over 5 years, we get a portion of that money to continuously deploy infrastructure in accordance with the program. The rules focus where we deploy infrastructure to designated alternative fuel corridors for that program. If you're not familiar, alternative fuel corridors are a designation that we work with FHWA to assign. And in Ohio, we actually have a pretty solid network of 16 alternative fuel corridors across the state. Of course, there are gaps, and we'll get into the current funding opportunity that seeks to help address some of those gaps. Generally, the funding supports 80% of project costs, with a 20% cost share required. So in our case, we're deploying or working to deploy that infrastructure right now. We're requiring that the bidder or the project team kick in the 20%, and the 80% will be provided by the federal dollars. Overall, the bipartisan infrastructure law authorized $7.5 billion for these charging and fueling efforts. So this again accounts for $5 billion, and $2.5 billion is accounted for in the charging and fueling infrastructure program that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So just sticking with the NEVI, again, as kind of just for everyone's reference, some of the more prescriptive requirements are shown here. Again, really, we're trying to enable long distance travel. So these stations are focused on interstates and U.S. and state routes, and they need to be provided every 50 miles. So they are trying to achieve a minimum spacing and allow for that long range travel. They also need to be within a mile of the interstate or the route, the corridor that they're being placed on. So I think the intent is that folks can easily hop on and off and have a similar experience with charging that you do to fueling your car with other forms of fuel. As an FYI, again, we are working on phase 1 of our deployment in accordance with NEVI, and that is mainly focused on interstates. We'll be doing U.S. and state routes afterwards. And in order to build out the interstate network across Ohio, we need 30 NEVI stations. So that's what we're trying to That's what we're working to procure right now, and we'll be looking to install hopefully later this year and next year. Other requirements with the NEVI program are that there be at least 4 DC fast or direct current fast chargers at each station. So for these fast chargers, they need to be 150 kilowatts, which is actually the higher end of the kind of fast charger designation. So these are especially fast, and they need to have at least 4 chargers. So pretty robust stations that we're talking about here. And I think the idea with establishing these requirements at a federal level across the country is that you have the availability and a similar experience for all of these chargers wherever you are, Ohio, Pennsylvania, whatever state. So that's the goal there. Now I'll give a quick update on where we are in the process. The NEVI program, the rules and the NOFO came out a little over a year ago, and we needed to submit a plan that established how we would deploy infrastructure in accordance with those rules. We submitted that plan at the end of summer of last year and got approval in September. And then we feverishly worked to develop a procurement process. So part of that was putting out a request for information to get some feedback from the bidding community and provide information on how to contract and work with federal grant dollars. And then we released an RFP based on kind of the information that we gathered in that RFI process. So our RFP went out October 31st of 2022, and we received bids in January. Very pleased to say that we got a ton of interest in that program. So I think that is a good indication of the appetite to install this equipment in the state of Ohio. Probably a good sign of interest in the upcoming grant opportunity as well. But of course, that means that we have a lot of work to do in review of all of the proposals that we received. So we are still working very actively to review those proposals, and we're hoping to issue or let bidders know about our awards at our selections in July. At the bottom of this timeline, we're showing some of the sort of federal program activities. And I think the pertinent to today's conversation are that we got the notice of funding opportunity for this charging and fueling infrastructure grant program, or CFI grant program, in the middle of March, so just a couple weeks ago. And these grant applications will be due May 30th. So those are, that May 30th date is really the one to watch. So now we'll get into the CFI grant opportunity specifically. And I just want to say, we're doing this presentation to try to share information that we know. A lot of this was gathered from the notice of a funding opportunity itself and the webinars that USDOT did that explained some of the rules established in the NOFO. We also have some opportunities to engage with USDOT and the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. With the NEVI program, we've got meetings and representatives that we're able to reach out to. So our other goal is to solicit questions from all of you that may be interested in applying for these funds and be able to try to track down answers. We'll do the best we can, not making promises, but we will certainly try. And so we're trying to, just share information. And we, of course, want to see Ohio receive as many of these federal dollars as available, and be successful in a lot of the applications that our locals are considering. So I'll start by talking about the funding. Again, $2.5 billion are available nationally for this CFI program. Right now, the Notice of Funding Opportunity has authorized $700 million available for fiscal years 22 and 23. They've said that, and of course, this broader CFI grant program umbrella encompasses 2 sub-programs, a corridor grant program and a community grant program. And we'll get into, what each of those covers. Similar to NEVI, these funds will support 80% of project costs and require a 20% cost share. So the difference, or I guess the intent of each of these programs overall, they will support not only electric vehicle charging, but also other alternative fueling, including hydrogen, natural gas, and propane. For the community charging grant program, the main goal seems to be to fill some of the gaps that we see in alternative fueling infrastructure or the alternative fueling network. So that can be, in the case of Ohio, I think we have a gap in our AFC network in Southeast Ohio, or that can just be providing chargers that are not necessarily as closely located or proximal to the alternative fuel corridors, more in the community, if you will. For the corridor grants, these are really to further build out the designated alternative fuel corridors. Of course, those could be built out with some redundancy for EV chargers or built out with other alternative fueling infrastructure. One of the things that the Notice of Funding Opportunity indicates is that applicants can apply for both programs simultaneously, and it sounds like USDOT will review and kind of assign which is the more appropriate pot or sub-program. Another kind of differentiator, we'll say, overall, this is not a differentiator, but all of these stations, all of these charging stations, fueling stations should be publicly accessible. So some of the potential station locations could be parking facilities that are publicly accessible, schools, parks, libraries. They could be on private property as long as they're publicly accessible. Now, for the corridor program, there are slightly more specific rules. In addition to them being publicly accessible, they also need to be relatively close to the alternative fuel corridors. For the EV charging stations, they need to be within a mile, and for the other alternative fueling stations, they need to be within 5 miles. So that's something to note when you're thinking about which program may be more applicable. More information on cost here. So each of the requests or applications has a sort of minimum and maximum for community charging. The minimum request amount is $500,000 and the maximum is $15 million. For the alternative fuel corridor grants, the minimum request is $1 million and there is no maximum. I can say that the NOFO made it seem like they're open to reviewing applications, that may fall outside of these bounds. I think that they have implied that they'll use their discretion here. So I think if anyone is developing a project that they know will have a cost associated that is outside of these bounds, we can try to follow up with USDOT to see if they would be open to reviewing that. A note here on the eligible applicants. So of course, states can apply, or MPOs can apply, local governments, basically all of our public agencies, including port authorities, and anyone that has ownership of the publicly accessible facility can apply for the community program. If you have questions about maybe whether or not you're an applicable applicant or an eligible applicant, then feel free to throw them in the chat and we can try to address that. I will note here at this point, we at the state are not planning to lead an application for this grant program for this particular NOFO. We have our hands pretty full with NEVI, but again, we want to support our local partners around the state, and we have some tools which we'll share in a little bit in order to help everyone develop their grant applications, and we also want to be aware of them because as I said, we are engaged in conversations with USDOT and can try to answer questions. And additionally, we have to do updates to Ohio's EV deployment plan every year in accordance with the NEVI program. So anywhere that we can show alignment and support, and I think show that all of our applications and efforts are complementary, I think will work in our favor and certainly help meet some of the criteria that have been established by USDOT here. So kind of getting into a read on how these applications will be evaluated. There are project merit criteria established in the notice funding opportunity. The 5 criteria are safety, climate change, resilience, and sustainability, equity and justice 40, workforce development, job quality and wealth creation, and then a general program vision. So you can kind of get the details on what each of those mean in the notice of funding opportunity, but we wanted to just pull out some of the priorities that stood out to us. And those are in terms of community program selection priorities. It certainly seems like they are very, very interested in projects that expand infrastructure in rural communities and in other communities that may have limited access. So those include low and moderate income and areas that have a low ratio of public parking spaces to households or high density. Basically any areas that might have issues with access to some of this infrastructure, they want to see that built out. So I think that's something to note as you're kind of selecting locations for placement. They are also very interested in, and that was one of the criteria in projects that prioritize safety. They don't want to create undue safety hazards with the implementation of these projects. So that's something to consider as well. The corridor program is really looking to improve the alternative fuel corridor network. So again, I kind of mentioned it before, but looking to provide redundancy along those networks. Again, the NEVI program is really targeted at building out those AFCs and EV charging stations specifically every 50 miles. But with the corridor program, they're looking to add redundancy where there might be high demand. So reducing congestion at existing stations or planned stations where they anticipate high volume or high demand seems to be a focus. Some other elements of focus here, one is environmental justice and Justice 40. For those of you that are unfamiliar, Justice 40 is the intention to funnel the 40% of the benefits of federal funding to communities that may disproportionately kind of experience consequences of climate change and other pollutants. So these are low-income communities, disadvantaged communities, communities that don't have access to affordable transportation. And so this is kind of, I can say from our experience with NEVI, it can be a difficult thing to quantify how 40% of the benefits of the program would benefit these communities. But what we've been working on, and I think what helps in the effort to achieve Justice 40, lots of engagement, particularly with those communities that I mentioned, the disadvantaged communities, and there are lots of ways to define that, and we can share what we looked at for NEVI, but there are also lots of other state-specific resources for what a disadvantaged community is. So lots of engagement with those communities, a focus on workforce and trying to make sure that the talent pipeline is being built up in those communities as well. That's another key piece and something that's been looked at favorably for our state. We received good feedback on our NEVI plan around mainly the workforce efforts, because I think it showed kind of statewide interest and real dedicated effort to providing a strong workforce and talent pipeline, looking at statewide where the gaps are and trying to make sure they're filled, and trying to make sure that we're focusing some of those workforce outreach efforts in those disadvantaged communities. And then of course there's the actual location of the infrastructure, which I think, you can certainly quantify whether you're locating them in disadvantaged communities, rural communities, and the like. Another aspect of focus here is collaboration and engagement. So this is highly encouraged. It seems like they will definitely prioritize projects that provide robust engagement and educational programs. And in fact, the community grant program allows you to spend some of the grant, those federal dollars, up to 5%, on engagement and educational programs related to alternative fueling. So that's pretty significant. That shows that they're really committed to that work. And workforce development and discussion of workforce development is kind of discussed throughout the evaluation criteria in both pots of the grant funding. Something else that came up was future-proofing and this kind of dig once philosophy, which really is to minimize cost and disruption of construction by thinking ahead and installing for current needs and potential future needs where practicable. In discussing this and trying to think about what this means tangibly for these applications, we know that there are some of our local partners that already have principles and policies that align with Dig Once. Morpsey is a good example. They have a Smart Streets policy where they make sure to consider digital infrastructure during project planning and development. So something like that, if your locality has that type of policy or is considering that for this project, I think that's worth noting as it's been indicated as a priority here for this program as well. And then the last piece of focus I'll mention is scalability, sort of similar mindset to the Dig Once, but scalability of whether these stations and your proposed projects can meet future demand is definitely a consideration here. Of course, with the corridor program, we're looking at redundancy and scalability for the actual alternative fuel corridors, but I think generally even partnerships show that we can that these projects kind of exceed our jurisdictional bounds, and there's wide-ranging support, and that speaks to the potential for scalability in the future. So that is an important piece of that. I think partnership is always looked at favorably, so that's something to consider as well. On this program in particular, we updated our website recently with our electric vehicle and alternative fuel charging resources. We now have a grant process guide and guides on what to consider when deploying EV chargers, all of which Megan, my co-presenter, will talk about in a second. We also have a one-pager specific to this grant opportunity, so I hope that you all will check them out and let us know if you have any questions, and hopefully they're helpful as folks start to conceptualize applications for these programs. I will kick it over to my colleague Megan Stein, who is with HNTB and a part of our project team that's supporting our EV infrastructure stakeholder engagement. And she's going to walk you through some of the guides that that have been developed to support all of you and our local partners. And Megan, I just made you presenter.
Thank you so much, Preeti. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you again, Preeti. As Preeti mentioned, DriveOhio has created a number of resources to help support locals and communities as they work to identify, secure, and administer grant funding opportunities. The first guidance document is what we're calling an EV grant process guide. Okay, excellent. This guide takes readers through an experience that navigates the process of grant funding and breaks it into 3 sections. First, what's the plan? In other words, how are we going to begin to think about an approach for grant funding? Second, how do we get there? Once we've mapped out the plan, what are the next steps in the application and team building process, and then eventually submitting the application? The third step is the where are we going? This is where you've either been successful or unsuccessful with your application. This resource will guide you through next steps as you consider opportunities going forward. So here's the section where we're considering what our plan is. Throughout the planning process, some key considerations include identifying resources, like this LTAP webinar today, for example. But what we're really wanting to do is keep our finger on the pulse of what opportunities are available for us. The next thing you want to do, and this is critical at this stage, is to build or strengthen relationships. Relationships can be built with planning organizations, technical experts, industry partners, and don't forget to request a letter of support from your state DOT. ODOT, for example, has a great online form to easily request a letter of support. You want to ensure alignment during this planning phase too. Look for funding that supports a challenge that you have. Don't create a problem to be able to qualify for a funding opportunity that's not the right fit. The last stage of the planning process is to prepare for a potential application by understanding what has already been done around the application topic. In this case, does a feasibility study exist? Is there a policy that could be put into place to make an application more successful, like permitting or coding? Okay, so let's take a quick peek at some of the resources the grant process guide will dive into. These are all linked in the guide that is posted on the DriveOhio website, as Preeti mentioned. This is the Joint Office's website for energy and transportation. Here you'll find access to technical assistance, data and tools, and perhaps most importantly for this phase of the grant process, a list of currently available funding opportunities. As I mentioned before, Local Technical Assistance Program, LTAP training options provided through ODOT will provide an introduction for available funding. This is just a screenshot of ODOT's LTAP website. As you can see, it's user-friendly and will help you navigate local opportunities. The last tool I'll highlight under the identification of resources is ODOT's website that houses real-time updates for current solicitations under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which includes basic program information, including funding types and levels, eligible applicants, and eligible projects. Once you visit this site, you'll be able to scroll down and see all of the helpful information. As we continue to navigate through the grant process, the next phase is the how do we get there consideration. Here, we want to work to build a team and designate what we're calling a grant champion. This person is going to lead the charge for this application. Next, consider past successes. So what does that mean? Do some homework here. What has already been successfully funded by this grantor in the past? You might be able to use that intelligence to build a stronger application. After that, you're going to want to pause and make a determination that we're calling the go or no go. Based on the work that you've done to date to learn about this opportunity, ask yourself, does it make sense to put resources behind this application, or have you discovered something that has you wondering if this opportunity is really worth the effort? Maybe there's no past precedent for funding your type of organization. Maybe you don't have capacity for such a heavy lift with the application. It's good to make that determination now in the process rather than later when you've dumped a bunch of resources into the process. The next step is to develop the grant package. Stay organized during this step. This is where you're really putting the puzzle pieces together. And DriveOhio's grant process guide will really walk you through considerations around developing a strong application. And finally, the last step of this phase is to submit. Don't skim past this part in the guide once you've got your hands on it. There's a lot to think about during the submission process, and making sure you understand all of the funders' submission guidelines is critical. I want to preview what the grants.gov site looks like. There's a lot more to grants.gov than what you'd think. This is where you'll register for an account to eventually submit your application if you're applying for a federal award. On this site, you can also get resources on how to apply for grants and how to create what's called a grant workspace, where you can add contributors and track the application process. I have not used the grant workspace feature, but I think it's a really neat integration and adaptation to grants.gov because it'll really help folks be able to collaborate and work together. So the final phase of the EV grant process guide is the where are we going consideration. Here, you're going to have one of two outcomes. You either have a successful proposal or an unsuccessful one. The grant process guide will walk you through what you should do no matter what the outcome. For example, if your project was unsuccessful, make sure to request a debrief. Try and understand why your project wasn't selected for funding. And if you were successful, you'll want to start planning for the administration of your project. Finally, at this phase, the very last step is to consider what it would mean to resubmit an application. So if you weren't successful, think about how you can transform your application and use your lessons learned to reapply for funding. Just make sure in this phase that you're reading the latest notice of funding opportunity or the latest NOFO to catch any changes to the rules or application process. Here's a resource the grant process guide will point you to. This resource is on grants.gov and it'll give you a helpful Grants 101 tutorial. This is great for folks that are relatively new to the grant administration process. So that was our EV grant process guide. So now we're going to talk about this other resource that DriveOhio has put together. The second resource is a guide that walks locals through what they should consider when deploying EV chargers. With all the funding coming available from the FHWA, like the CFI grant we're talking about today, this tool will be a great resource to navigate the process of deploying EV chargers in your community. So with this EV chargers deployment guide, we've broken the process into three basic sections. We've got the plan section, the procure section, and the operations and maintenance, or the O&M section. I'll go into a little more detail in the next few slides about these various sections. So these are screenshots from the actual guides in the resource. So I'll be showing it here, but again, this resource is posted on the DriveOhio website in its entirety. So I've broken it up and done some screenshots, but you'll be able to see the whole thing, including the resources on the DriveOhio website today. You can see that in the plan phase, this is where we're identifying the project team, determining the vision, goals, and plan, and also engaging stakeholders. You'll see considerations for each of the action items that are on the left-hand side, and those considerations are on the top box on the right-hand side. Additionally, for many of the action items, DriveOhio has linked resources. These resources are in that bottom box on the screen. Some of these are Ohio-based resources, and then some are from different parts of the country. They'll help you to determine how best to deploy EV chargers in your area. Some resources are studies, while others link to interactive tools and dashboards. Speaking of dashboards, this is an example of a resource DriveOhio links to, and it's the Ohio Alternative Fuel Vehicle Registration dashboard that DriveOhio created. Here you can search alternative fuel vehicle registrations by year, month, region, and county. The tool allows users to understand patterns and needs for charging. The next section of the deployment guide is the procurement phase. In this phase of deployment, the guide will review action items around procurement approach, contract terms, site planning, along with installation. There are corresponding considerations, like the previous slide, for each of these action items and the resources to help guide you as well. This section of the guide is probably the most detailed, with a ton of considerations for procurement approach and contract terms. To develop this guide, DriveOhio worked with folks that have an extensive history in EV charger deployment at the city level. So you're getting access to information as a result of real life lessons learned from city applications. So we have a series of resources linked to this section as well. And the resource that I'm going to share with you here is the EVSE Site Design Recommendations from the U.S. Access Board. So this guide is pointing you directly where you need to go to determine design recommendations for accessible EV charging, which is so important as you work your way through EV charger deployment. The final phase here in the operations and maintenance, or the O&M as we label it here, this phase is where we're outlining action items around reporting, education and training, and future planning and ongoing engagement. The considerations for this section ask a series of questions to determine what data you're going to collect and what you'll eventually do with that information. This phase really encourages coordination and planning for future and EV charger deployment. The resource example that I'm sharing here under the O&M section is the official website for the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, or EVITP. If this name or acronym sounds familiar, it's because it's referenced in it's referenced as being an acceptable certifying entity under the NEVI final rule. So this resource will not only walk you through how to navigate the training program to become certified, but it'll also allow you to find a certified contractor in your area as well. Again, all of this information, including the guides we've reviewed today and all of their associated resources, can be found on the DriveOhio website under the Funding Resources section. With that, I'll hand it back over to Preeti to review our next steps.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate that run through. So what's next? We really want to point folks to the resource materials that we developed that Megan just ran through on our website. You can also check out the CFI funding page on FHWA's website. Of course, that has the detailed notice of funding opportunity, all of the rules that they've included in there. They've also posted their webinar that they provided last week, I believe, and the slides that they put together for that webinar. So that's kind of a synopsis of what you'll find in the notice of funding opportunity. The third thing here is it's really important. Please reach out to your local metropolitan planning organization or regional transportation planning organization to inquire about what applications are going on in the region. As we said, partnership is a tremendous benefit to these grant applications. I've also seen some questions come in already on whether or not certain types of folks are eligible to apply. And if you're not eligible, a way to be part of this program may be to see what applications are out there and whether you can be included in some way, shape, or form. And then the final thing that Megan mentioned here is to please request a letter of support for your applications. One, we want to know what all the applications are across the state. We want to know what Ohio is looking to accomplish to ensure that we're supportive and that we're all singing from the same hymn book and can communicate any information upwards with whatever opportunities that we have. But also we'd love to provide letters of support. So we have an online form for that process, and we prefer to get all of those requests by May 14th for the May 30th deadline. With that, I think we will just go right into responding to questions. We were hoping to save a good amount of time here to interact and to answer questions. So I'll start with some of the questions that we got in the questions box here in the webinar. But I think if folks want to raise their hands as well, we can also take people off mute and address additional questions verbally if you're comfortable. So I'll start with the questions that we received, and a few of them are about whether or not private companies, convenience stores, individuals are eligible to apply for the CFI program. And the answer on their own, no, not eligible. All of the eligible applicants that I showed on that table at the beginning of the slideshow are all government entities. So the applications are going to need to be led by a government entity, an MPO, local authority, and similar. But the funds themselves can be used to contract with private entities. In the case of the Corridor Grant Program, all of the funds received must actually be used to contract with a private entity. So I think they're, thinking that those funds would be used to execute contracts with private sector. And in the Community Grant Program, they use the term may. So those funds may be used to contract with private entities. So there may be some other avenues, things like using some of the money for engagement and for education and other ways that maybe would be government resources versus private, but we can still use those funds to contract with private entities as well. I'm going to keep going here. This is a really good question from Matthew Lindsay. Is there any way a local government can know where the NEVI deployments are going to happen before the May 30th deadline? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We really are working as fast as we can. If we had that information before, we would let folks know as soon as possible, but it's just taking us a long time to get through all of the applications, so we won't have the answer. I would say the thing you can look at is our interactive map that shows you the interchanges that we're looking at providing the station at. Of course, that's not terribly specific. In some cases, it's a group of many interchanges, and we will just have one station across those many interchanges. But at this point and before May 30th, that's going to be as specific as we could get in terms of those locations. And I'm sorry, I'm reading these as I go. I work for a small government and we're interested in increasing EV chargers with the city. Are there funds available now, or is this something we need to wait for? So these funds, the $700 million that was authorized in this notice of funding opportunity for the CFI program is available for folks that want to apply and are successful. These are discretionary grant programs. This is a discretionary grant program. So it's competitive in nature. We are competing with the rest of the nation to get a share of this funding, but I'm hopeful that Ohio will receive at least a portion of it. Have you had questions from local jurisdictions regarding zoning controls on placement of EV charging stations? That's a really good question. I haven't. I don't know if Megan, if you have any experience dealing with local zoning controls related to EV charging stations. I know that it can be different depending on the locality.
Yeah, it's really different, as you mentioned, Preeti, from community to community, county to county, city to city. But the how to deploy EV chargers guide that DriveOhio put together, it has a lot of helpful resources around permitting and codes and kind of restrictions and some lessons learned that the city of Columbus faced and kind of took away from the Smart Columbus initiative. So I would definitely point folks back to that resource guide to look into code and permitting kind of restrictions and lessons learned for EV chargers.
Great. I'm just kind of reading down the list, so sorry if we get repetitive. But the next question is tackling a different issue. In the case of parking lots, are managing parking private entities allowed to charge for the use of the parking lot? I think if the question is around the ability to charge for the charging and fueling, then yes, the private entity can certainly charge for charging and fueling once that infrastructure has been installed. With the NEVI program, the funding, and with this program as well, the funding is to install, operate, maintain the equipment itself, the infrastructure itself, and the private sector is expected to charge for that. It's not expected to be a free provision. I am going to give a shout out, and sorry we didn't do that earlier, but Clean Fuels Ohio is another partner and resource for statewide assistance with putting together some of your applications. So Jacob Swemline is on the line here, and he is a rep from Clean Fuels Ohio, and they can certainly help with our local partners as they're trying to figure out where to get started. Another good question from Eduardo, is there any funding available for upgrading existing EV infrastructure? Megan, I'm looking at you because I believe the funds can be used to upgrade existing infrastructure. I believe that that's in line with some of the priorities for redundancy, and but I just want to be sure if you've seen anything different.
Yeah, that's my read as well, Preeti. We'll want to make sure that with that there's compliance with NEVI even under the CFI program. But yes, yeah, that is my read as well.
Okay. Is there a partnership list or private entity list where you can sign up to see how we can partner with a state agency? That's another good question. We are planning to post on our website a private partnership list. So I'm not sure if this is getting at what you're asking for, Rosalind. For that, this is not our idea, we're copying Michigan and California. The intent of the private partner list is to allow folks in the private sector, whether they are equipment providers or site hosts or folks that want to maintain the equipment, operate the equipment, and kind of anyone that could be related to the life cycle of this charging equipment. It's an avenue for you to post your information, and it's a live kind of display of all of the other interested private partners so that people can see who all is interested, get contact information, and reach out to one another to form connections that could be that could lead to the development of some project teams kind of down the road. Because again, these dollars are going to be spent to contract with private entities, whether one or a team of private entities.
To that, Preeti, too, I might add that again, as we mentioned on this slide, reaching out to the local MPO or RTPO in your area is going to be, I think, folks, one of the greatest opportunities to put together a collaborative application. So more than likely, the MPO or RTPO in your area is going to either know who's applying, or they could be applying themselves as a lead applicant. So definitely reach out to your local MPO.
Absolutely. There's a question here on how soon the money from this program would be available. The Appalachia Community Grant Program might be able to match funds. That's a really good question from Gabe. I don't have insight, Megan. I'm not sure if they addressed that on the webinar. We can follow up and try to find that out.
We'll find that out. Yeah.
And we'll follow up. Another thing I'll follow up with, there's a question here from Kayla on where is the map where we can see what interchanges we're looking to provide chargers at for NEVI. We'll follow up with a link to that. It is on our website under the NEVI deployment plan, but we'll follow up with a specific link.
And in terms of funding timing, Preeti, you mentioned this earlier in the webinar, but just to reiterate, this is the first of 3 rounds of funding under this CFI program. So we're anticipating 2 more rounds to come out. The exact timing is not quite clear, but we will follow up on that.
Correct. We have a few questions here on the source of the cost match. That's again the 20%. So the federal dollars will support 80% of the eligible project costs, and 20% need to be matched. There is a question on whether there are plans for utilizing turnpike revenue credits or other state match for these programs. The answer is no on that. In theory, turnpike revenue credits could be used, but I don't think we have nearly enough. Well, I can't say that, but I know that we can't use other state dollars for EV or alternative fuel charging. That is against the Ohio Constitution. So we can't do that. That's why for the NEVI program, we've asked the bidding community, the vendors themselves, the private entities, to contribute 20%. And as I mentioned at the top, we've received a tremendous amount of interest. So I would expect it would be very similar for this grant program. Are there any restrictions or guidance on where the cost share needs to come from? I'm not aware of specific guidance on that front. And I think that different states can handle it differently. As I've said, the state will not be contributing funds, but if there are locals that can, or if there are other grants, I'm not sure if you could use federal dollars to match. I actually don't think you can do that, but we can try to get more guidance on that. Are you requiring zoning approval prior to approving an application? That's really a question, a local question, I believe. And so that can be fielded to your NPO or to find out what local applications are happening. Can these funds be used to add chargers into apartment complexes for the use of for the primary use of tenants? That's a good question. These chargers need to be publicly accessible, so they could not be sort of intended to primarily serve the apartment complex. We've had this question kind of in different forms with the NEVI program as well. And I think that we can continue to try to get a very clear answer, because one of the things that comes to my mind is that it's fleet charging. And if we want to install facilities, charging or fueling facilities for specific fleets that are publicly accessible but may be utilized by fleets more often, that would kind of limit their accessibility to the public. So it's a little bit of a lingering question to me, how publicly accessible they need to be, and I guess how much they want to prioritize that. So that's another thing we can follow up on. We can also share a list of MPOs and RTPOs. We can share links to all of those sites, or even contacts where possible, to make that a little bit easier for folks here. And I'm sorry, I'm going to jump back up to see if there are other questions that I missed.
Preeti, there was one specifically on a bid with a specific company for what we received for our NEVI bids. At this point, ODOT's still reviewing those bids, and we will not be answering those questions until we make award. So any equipment that's required will be required to meet the NEVI guidelines, but we won't be talking about any bidders or any sites specifically at this time and until we make award.
That's right. There's a question early on, and admittedly, I will field this to Megan. Does the equipment need to be maintained for a minimum duration after installation? With the NEVI program, we are requiring 5 years of operation and maintenance as part of what we're looking to procure, and that is supported. That is an eligible project cost for the federal rules. For the CFI program, is it the same?
That's a really good question, Preeti. I think I might need to follow up on that one later. I mean, we know that the CFI NOFO cites compliance with the NEVI program, but I will look into that and we can have that be one of the follow-up questions.
Okay. I see another question, and I think I addressed it before, but just want to say that the charging and the fueling infrastructure can be, you can charge fees for that infrastructure. It does not need to be no cost. So I saw that in there again. Julie, are there any other questions I missed? I was trying to consolidate.
I didn't see anything. I mean, we hit the major topics that when I scanned through them, that people were asking, and we can follow up on the ones that people asked that we weren't sure about.
Okay, great. I see a comment in here from Andrew Shepler, our grants expert at ODOT, and he just wanted to note here, in terms of the question about when funds will be available, the entity will need to enter into a grant agreement with FHWA first before the funds are available. That is, of course, very true. In our experience with other grant programs, this can take a long time, months, possibly even up to a year. So it's important to note that it's also important to note that this is reimbursement based and not a lump sum payment once entered into a grant agreement. That's a good point there. And again, more than likely, most of these funds will be used to contract with private entities. So in our experience with NEVI funding, the funds were made available, but then we needed to work to get out a request for proposal. We needed to initiate the procurement process to actually be able to start spending those funds. And we still haven't gotten there. As you've heard many times, we're still reviewing proposals. So it will probably take a while to get these dollars out the door. But, you know, securing them in the state of Ohio is, of course, the first step. I think with that, we will conclude today's webinar and really appreciate everyone's interest and all of the attendance on this. We will definitely follow up probably tomorrow. We have a touch point with USDOT, so we'll follow up afterwards, try to address some of those questions that we weren't able to just now in the Q&A, and we'll share all of the links that are included in this slideshow, but also some of the other information that we discussed. So with that, feel free to reach out to DriveOhio. We have a contact list if you're specifically interested in NEVI or related, you know, this related grant program, and we can answer questions as they come throughout this process. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Preeti. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Paula. Bye-bye.